Now, last summer, American scientists wrote in the journal Nature that it appears that human beings have an upper limit when it comes to age. Scientists looked at mortality data from the last 40 or 50 years from Japan, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And they determined that after examining all these well-kept records, that 115 years of age seems to be the oldest that any of us can hope to achieve. Only 1 in 10,000 of us will make it that far. If you were to take the 4 million kindergartners enrolled in the United States this year, these are children born in 2012, only 400 of them will make it to 115 years of age. Of course, there are outliers. But the last one who made it over 120 years died in 1997. She made it to 122 years, and she was a French woman who had been there when, I guess, Napoleon was still in power. I'm kidding, but one of the Napoleons. Of course, we know that the maximum limit is not the same as an average lifespan. If you look at the numbers from the last recorded year, it was 2014, a man will live to be about 76 years old, and a woman 81 years old. And those numbers have actually gone down in the last couple of years as our lifestyles have changed. How many of you are scared by that? Anybody? Numbers get close pretty quickly, don't they? Christopher Bullock, he's the author of a book published in 1716 called The Cobbler of Preston. And he once wrote that it is impossible to insure of anything but death and taxes. Now, this was a quote later made famous by Benjamin Franklin in 1789. Of course, it was written as a joke that the only two things we could rely on in this life are death and taxes, the joke being about the taxes, but the truth is about death. We are all going to die. You are going to die. I am going to die. And yet we act as if we aren't. Can I hear an amen to that? Amen. We ignore warning signs of health. Christy Boyce, who is here, has a co-worker at her car dealership that she works at. 49 years old, he'd been having heart attacks since January and had been ignoring them, thinking it was gas. You know, you can't ignore stuff like that. And how many of you are married to a stubborn person? Right? Now, my wife would raise her hand because I'm stubborn. We don't write wills. We don't buy life insurance or even plan for our death when one day it will come. We don't talk to our spouses and our friends about our wishes and our dreams for them after death comes to us. Too often we only think about death when there's a funeral, and it better not be ours. And in 20 minutes or 40 minutes or an hour later, we are having that wonderful meal that we eat after the funeral, and then maybe 2 hours later we have said, oh yeah, I need to write my will, and then you forget about it. We hold off on major decisions as if we have all the time in the world to make them. Now you're probably wondering, why is he talking about death on the second week in September? Right? Anybody worried about that? Well, as we continue our study on God's season of creation, we hear more about the story of Moses in the book of Exodus. Last week we heard about Moses being called by a bush. You know, the flaming bush God calls him to save the people of Israel from the Egyptians. So we skip ahead 9 chapters, and now we're in chapter 12. A whole lot has happened in those 9 chapters. Moses goes to Egypt. Moses confronts Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him, no, I'm not going to let your people go. In the wonderful language of the Old Testament, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh is a stubborn man who doesn't want his slave labor to disappear. And so Moses promises to the Pharaoh that God will send down 10 plagues to change Pharaoh's mind. Now, what are those 10 plagues? Well, the first 9 are this. The water of the Nile and the groundwater will be turned to blood, and it is turned to blood. That's kind of rough. How are you going to get your water out if it's all blood? You don't want to drink that. Secondly, there is a plague of frogs that falls from the sky. Now, that one kind of sounds funny, doesn't it? How many would you like to, take a shovel full of frogs? I mean, we have snowstorms, so I don't think frogs would be fun. Third, lice attacks everyone. Anybody who's ever been a parent had to wash that lice out of that kid's hair, know how problematic that is. Fourth, wild animals and flies infest Egypt. Fifth, livestock begin to fall ill and die. Sixth, animals and human beings are given painful sores called boils. Seventh, thunderstorms bring down deadly hail. Eighth, the locusts come and eat all the crops. Ninth, darkness comes. A darkness that cannot be driven back by any light, including firelight or moonlight or the stars. For 3 days, there is complete blackness. And yet, those 9 things, those 9 plagues happening, you know what? Pharaoh's heart is still hardened. He is still stubborn. He says, I'm not going to let your people go. And so the final plague comes. We hear that in chapter 12. And we hear Moses making preparations with his people, saying, hey, if you're faithful, if you do everything I tell you, God will save you. God will pass over you that night. Moses educates his people in the way of Passover. They slaughter a lamb, they smear the blood on the doorframe, they eat unleavened bread and fire-roasted lamb, and wear their shoes and clothes and have a staff in Herod so they can flee at a moment's notice. It's called Passover, and it's something that the Jewish people still celebrate every year. Now, we often don't know when our death will come, but Moses, by God's direction, can tell the people of Egypt and the Hebrews that death is coming that very night. And after the devastation of death, including the death of the Pharaoh's firstborn son, the Hebrews are able to begin their exodus out of Egypt. Now, I don't know about you, but this is one of those troublesome texts from the Bible, right? If God is such a loving and just God, why would God cause people to die? Why would God strike down the firstborn? What about those innocent firstborn babies? What about the animals that provide prosperity and livelihood to the people? And I want you to think about the firstborn in your lives. Now, in my family, if all the firstborn were struck down, only my youngest son Gabriel would still be alive. I'm an oldest son. My wife is an oldest daughter. Wesley is my firstborn son. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if all the firstborns were taken away? The devastation wrought by that loss would be overwhelming. There is an explanation given to us in verse 12 of chapter 12 of Exodus as the final plague is announced. God says to Moses, I will bring judgment to all the gods of Egypt. The 10 plagues, you see, well, they're a direct attack on the false idols that the people put their faith in. Animals, material goods, even the cycles of flood and drought in the Nile would be put in their natural place. Even the concept of immortality would be tested as the firstborn would die, leaving behind a nation to grieve the loss of their natural leaders and those who inherit the most. Maybe it's not all that complicated. Maybe what we hear with modern ears as readers of the Bible is to understand that death comes and we have no power in the face of death. We live in a world where we pursue youthful decisions. We try to find that fountain of youth, don't we, with genetic research, and we try to improve the longevity of our life. Even the science fiction writers like to say we're going to download ourselves into a artificial intelligence at some point and live forever there. But despite all of our attempts to become like God, to make all humanity a God, we can do nothing except respond with faith to the unseen and powerful God. We are all going to die. You are going to die. I'm going to die. And nothing we can do can change that reality. All right, so I can just leave it there, right? But you probably want to know, well, what do we do? What do we as Christians do about death? How do we as Christians face death? Well, I came up with a list of things, and hopefully I won't bore you to death with this list. First, I think we need to admit that we are all going to die. There is going to be an end to life. I think we have to admit that. And not just run away from it. Secondly, I think we need to turn to the Bible. I think 1 Corinthians 15 and the Gospel of John chapter 14, well, these two chapters of the Bible, no matter what else you read, 1 Corinthians 15 and John chapter 14, these two chapters tell us more about what we can expect than anything else can. Third, we should weep. In John 11:35, Jesus wept. The shortest verse of the whole Bible in the King James Version. Jesus wept over the loss of his friend Lazarus. In Lamentations and in Jeremiah, we hear God celebrating and mourning the loss of his people, and the people mourning the loss of their God. Grief is an appropriate response to death. And we shouldn't fear death. I believe that one reason we don't talk about death is in our families and with our loved ones, or even think about it in our personal lives, because we're afraid of losing life. We know that we fear aging because then our dreams disappear. I'm never going to be the quarterback for the Cowboys or an Olympian, right? We mourn what could have been, but then as we get older, I think we begin to fear the unknown. And there's nothing more unknown than death. Fortunately, our faith has taught us that there is something beyond this life. Paul writes about it in 1 Corinthians 15 as he says that death is not the end because we have the promise of resurrection. And yes, we know that there will be times in our life that are hard. There will be times when we desire death to take us away from pain or difficulty. It's something that I encounter all the time as a pastor, especially with people who say, "Why am I suffering?" And so the question arises, should we seek an end to our life? There are those in Christianity who say that suicide is a mortal sin that will forever separate us from God. Well, I'm not going to stand there and say that, because I believe that God will search our heart, and we will have to account for our actions in this life and the effects that our lives have on others. But I also believe that God's infinite grace and wisdom will understand our motivations and our struggles. But I challenge you, if you are somebody who is suicidal, or if you know somebody who is, and if you are somebody who believes in Christ, take heart in the words of Paul, who once suffered in prison at the hands of Roman authorities who tortured him. You see, he wrote to the Philippians these words. As he was talking about the decision whether to live or die, he says, "I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and to be with Christ, for that is far better." But then he continues by saying, "But to remain in flesh is more necessary for you." You see, Paul had a call in his life. He says, this suffering is not fun, and I really want to die. But I know that God has put me on for the purpose. And if that purpose is that I suffer so that you may know God even more, then how good is that? So we should not seek death to escape suffering, because we are never sure how our suffering will be a witness to others. And perhaps our struggle with a long-term illness will bring a son or daughter to God, or maybe our pain will allow us to believe even more fiercely in all of God's gifts. Next, I think we take the advice that Paul gave to the Corinthians in one of his first letters. He wrote in chapter 12, "We rejoice with those who rejoice. We weep with those who weep." And finally, when we do come to the time of death, don't be afraid. Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, gathered his disciples together and blessed them. And according to the Gospel of John, Jesus spoke to them for hours, trying to prepare them for the time when he would no longer be with them. And we can do the same with those that we love. I think it's important for us to teach our children about the frailty of life. Now, part of the hazard of being a pastor is that I go to a lot of funerals. Oftentimes I have to be the one speaking at those funerals. And the hazard of being a clergy couple is that my wife has a lot of funerals. And for the last month, my wife and I have had funerals almost every week. And my kids pick up on our moods, and they know that something is happening. Of course, they ask, well, who died? Because, they're wanting to know, is it somebody they know? And so we've had a lot of learning experiences and teachable moments, as they call them, as we explain to them what life and death is and how it's a natural part of our existence. As I like to say, it's just another season that we go through. And maybe none of this advice is enough, but I do want you to remember the prayer that we often say in our funerals. And I want you to remember the wisdom written by people of faith who have long departed from us. O God, who gave us birth, you are ever more ready to hear than we are to pray. You know our needs before we ask, and our ignorance in asking. Give to us now your grace that as we shrink before the mystery of death, we may see the light of eternity. Speak to us once more your solemn message of life and death, and help us to live as those who are prepared to die. And when our days here are accomplished, enable us to die as those who go forth to live, so that living or dying our life may be in you, and that nothing in life or death will be able to separate us from your great love in Jesus Christ. Now, if we live to 115 years of age, I think we should be thankful, and I think we should be amazed. In that lifetime, we would have had our heartbeat over 4.8 billion times. We would have celebrated over 42,000 sunrises. We would have witnessed over 1,400 full moons, and maybe one or two eclipses, right? But life is more than a formula of heartbeats beaten and sunrises shining. Life is about the love that we share with others. It's about the love that we receive from God, the forgiveness that we have received from God, and the way we share that love and forgiveness with our friends, our family, and, of course, with ourselves. So I challenge you, church, do not be afraid, for God is with you. Amen.